Hamburg, July 24, 1943. Just after midnight. High above the blacked-out city, a Royal Air Force navigator named Sergeant reaches into a cardboard box at his feet. Inside are bundles of black paper backed with aluminium foil, cut into strips roughly 30 centimeters long. On a signal from the pilot, he opens the escape hatch and begins posting them out, one bundle every minute, into the freezing slipstream. The strips tumble away into the darkness, catching what little light there is, scattering and drifting like a strange metallic snow. 40 kilometers away, in a concrete bunker on the edge of the city, a German radar operator stares at his cathode ray tube in disbelief. Moments earlier, his screen showed a manageable number of aircraft, tracked with the precision his equipment was built for. Now it is a blizzard of white specks, hundreds of them, thousands, an unreadable storm of false echoes. Somewhere within that storm are 791 real bombers. He cannot tell which blips are aluminium and which are aircraft carrying 4 tons of high explosive and incendiaries. His guns, tied to that radar picture, fall silent, or worse, fire blindly into empty sky. This is the opening night of Operation Gomorrah, the RAF's assault on Hamburg, and the storm on that screen has a name. The crews call it Window. It costs almost nothing to make. A roll of kitchen foil, a pair of scissors, cardboard, and paper would do the job in a pinch, though the real strips were manufactured to a precise specification. And yet this simple, cheap, almost childish idea would do something that years of armor plating, evasive routing, and desperate improvisation had failed to achieve. It would make Bomber Command's aircraft, for one crucial night, effectively invisible. To understand why a few tons of foil strips mattered more than almost any single piece of hardware fielded during the bomber offensive, you have to understand what it had cost, by the summer of 1943, simply to fly a bombing raid into Germany and come home again. The problem Bomber Command faced was not merely finding the target, it was surviving the journey there and back through a defensive system that had, by 1943, become extraordinarily sophisticated. Germany had spent years constructing the Kammhuber line, a network of radar stations and night fighter boxes stretching from Denmark down through the Low Countries, each box roughly 32 kilometers across, each one containing a Freya, early warning radar to detect incoming bombers at range, and a pair of Würzburg radars, one locked onto a defending night fighter and one locked onto the bomber, feeding a ground controller who could talk the fighter onto its target with unnerving accuracy. Layered behind this were tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns, themselves increasingly guided by radar-directed predictors that could put a shell within lethal range of an aircraft flying blind in cloud at night at altitude. The statistics told a grim story. Through the winter of 1942 into 1943, Bomber Command's losses hovered around 5% of aircraft dispatched on a typical raid, and on the worst nights against the best defended targets, losses climbed towards 10% or beyond. Simple arithmetic made this unsustainable. A crew required to complete a tour of 30 operations, at a 5% loss rate per sortie, faced odds of survival that no actuary would have found comforting. Many crews did not come close to finishing a tour. The Battle of the Ruhr, fought through the spring of 1943, had proven that German industry could be hurt, but it had also proven, night after night, that the cost of reaching it was climbing. Existing countermeasures had achieved only partial success. Bombers flew in a loose bomber stream, concentrating in time and space to try to overwhelm individual night fighter boxes, but the stream itself could still be tracked by the string of Freya and Würzburg stations along its route, each one handing the bomber off to the next like a relay race with fatal stakes. Radio countermeasures existed, jamming devices with names like Mandrel and Tinsel, designed to drown out German fighter control frequencies and early warning radar, but the Germans adapted, switching frequencies, developing workarounds. Corkscrew evasive maneuvers could throw off a night fighter's aim in the final seconds of an attack, but did nothing to stop the Würzburg from finding the bomber in the first place. What was needed was not a way to survive the German system. It was a way to make the German system fail to see the threat at all, and by early 1943 that had seemed close to a fantasy. The answer had in fact existed for the better part of a year before it was used, sitting in a drawer, deliberately unused, because both sides had discovered the same trick at almost the same time, and each was terrified of being the one to reveal it first.
The technical principle behind window was worked out by scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, based by 1943 at Malvern in Worcestershire, the same organization responsible for much of Britain's radar development throughout the war. The idea itself was elegant almost to the point of simplicity. Radar works by sending out a pulse of radio energy and listening for the echo that bounces back from a solid object, in this case an aircraft made of aluminium and steel. If you could scatter into the air a cloud of small metallic reflectors, each one cut to roughly half the wavelength of the enemy radar you wish to blind, each strip would resonate with that radar pulse and throw back an echo of its own, indistinguishable on a screen from the echo of a real aircraft. Fill the sky with enough of these strips, and the radar operator is presented not with one aircraft, but with hundreds of ghost contacts, all reflecting identically, all impossible to sort from the real threat hidden somewhere among them. Joan Curran, a physicist working at the TRE, is generally credited with the practical development of the foil strips themselves, refining the size, weight, and packing method needed to make bundles that would disperse properly in a slipstream and produce an effective echo when tuned against the Würzburg radar's operating wavelength of around 53 centimeters. The strips settled on measured roughly 30 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters, about the size of a bookmark, light enough that a bomber's standard load of bundles weighed only a modest addition to the aircraft's overall payload. Manufacturing was subcontracted out to firms across Britain under strict secrecy, paper mills and foil suppliers producing millions of strips without being told what they were for. The finished bundles packed into boxes and distributed to bomber stations under a code name that gave away nothing. The reason it sat unused for so long was a standoff at the highest levels of Allied command. British scientists had understood the principle since at least the summer of 1942, and intelligence suggested German scientists had independently discovered exactly the same vulnerability, developing their own version they called Duppel after the Berlin suburb where it was tested. Churchill's scientific advisor, Frederick Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, and the air staff wrestled for months over whether to authorize its use, weighing the devastating advantage it would hand Bomber Command against the near certainty that German bombers, still capable of raiding British cities, would promptly adopt the same technique against London's own radar defenses. It was only in July 1943, with Bomber Command planning the concentrated assault on Hamburg and the potential gains judged to outweigh the risk, that window was finally released for operational use. The results on that first night exceeded almost every expectation. Crews reported the German night fighter control system collapsing into confusion within minutes of the first bundles going out. Ground controllers audibly baffled over the radio as their screens filled with echoes, searchlights, and flak batteries firing without coordination or simply falling silent, uncertain what, if anything, they were aiming at. Losses for that opening raid on Hamburg came in dramatically below the rates Bomber Command had been suffering on comparably defended targets. A handful of aircraft lost from the force rather than the dozens that might have been expected, and crews who flew that night frequently described the experience in the same terms: an eerie, unfamiliar sense of the German defenses simply failing to find them. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It costs nothing, and it tells the channel there's an audience for stories like this one. Documented accounts of Windows' effect over Hamburg across the week-long series of raids that made up Operation Gomorrah describe a defensive system that never fully recovered its coordination, though it would be wrong to claim German defenses were rendered totally impotent. Individual night fighters using visual contact, and later new detection methods, continued to inflict losses on other operations throughout 1943. What can be said with confidence, drawn from surviving RAF operational records, is that the immediate measurable effect on losses during the Hamburg raids was substantial, and aircrew testimony from the period is consistent in describing German ground control as audibly, chaotically overwhelmed. Precise figures on how many aircraft windows saved, as opposed to other factors such as weather or routing, remain a matter of historical estimation rather than certainty, since it is impossible to rerun the raid without the countermeasure to produce a clean comparison. The German response, once the shock passed, was to develop new tactics rather than new hardware,
since no radar fix could easily filter foil from aircraft. Night fighter crews shifted towards a freelance method nicknamed Wild Sow, or Wild Boar, using single-engine day fighters guided by voice broadcast and visual sighting over the burning target itself rather than relying on ground-directed radar interception, essentially abandoning the compromised system for a cruder but window-proof alternative. This in turn shows how completely window had broken the previous method of defense. An air force built around one of the most advanced integrated radar networks in the world had been forced back towards pilots looking out of a cockpit window by moonlight and fire glow. Germany's own equivalent, Duplo, sat in exactly the same locked drawer for exactly the same reason, and when the Luftwaffe finally did use window-type strips against British radar later in the war, notably in early 1944, the returns were far more limited, largely because Britain's air defense network had been developed with far greater redundancy and had already spent months preparing countermeasures once Windows' release made further secrecy pointless. The American 8th Air Force, flying daylight raids over Germany, adopted an equivalent countermeasure, which they called Chaff, though the tactical value proved somewhat different in daylight conditions where visual identification supplemented radar tracking in ways that darkness denied German controllers over Hamburg. What set the British achievement apart was less the invention itself, since both sides discovered the principle independently and at roughly the same time, and more the decision of when to deploy it, concentrated for maximum shock against a single, symbolically and industrially significant target, rather than trickled out and blunted by early enemy adaptation. The legacy of window extends a very long way past the summer of 1943. In the most direct sense, the technique that scattered strips of foil over Hamburg is the direct ancestor of chaff, still carried by military aircraft today, still deployed in exactly the same principle of resonant reflectors confusing radar-guided threats, whether those threats are anti-aircraft guns or, in the modern era, radar-guided missiles. Beyond the purely technical lineage, window represents one of the clearest demonstrations in the entire war of a recurring truth about the electronic battlefield: that a sufficiently cheap countermeasure, correctly timed, can neutralize an enemy investment worth many times its cost, and that secrecy itself is a weapon, since the 6 months window sat unused were arguably as strategically significant as the night it was finally released. Examples of the original foil strips, along with the wider story of British electronic warfare in the period, can today be seen at the RAF Museum and at the Bomber Command Memorial Exhibitions, small, unglamorous scraps of blackened paper and aluminium that briefly blinded one of the most advanced defensive networks on Earth. Return, for a moment, to that German radar operator in his bunker outside Hamburg, watching his screen dissolve into noise. Everything about his equipment was sound. The Würzburg sets were precise, the Freya network was extensive, the training of the men reading those screens was thorough, and none of it mattered because the assumption underneath all of it, that a radar echo meant a real and solid target, had been quietly and comprehensively broken by a few tons of foil dropped out of a bomb bay. That is the story of window in a single image, an empire's worth of precision engineering, defeated not by a bigger gun or a faster fighter, but by cardboard, aluminium, and the willingness to wait 6 months for exactly the right night to use it. What Bomber Command achieved on the night of July 24, 1943 was not simply a successful raid. It was proof that the electronic war being fought in parallel with the shooting war could, in a single night, unmake years of defensive investment. The foil fell, the screens filled with static, and for one crucial stretch of nights over one German city, The most sophisticated air defense system in the world was rendered, in the most literal sense, unable to see straight, cheap, simple, almost absurdly low-tech. And for the crews flying through skies that should have killed far more of them than it did, it was very possibly the difference between coming home and not coming home at all.